All right. Let folks- All right. Thanks, Shelby. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi.
Thanks, James.
Hi, Eric.
Hey, Shelby.
All right, folks, I think we're going to go and get started. I know there's still some folks that are getting connected, and but we do want to go ahead and get started in the conversation. So my name is EJ Reedy. I'm a senior director at the building you see behind us, the Polsky Exchange, as well as a much larger kind of virtual space for the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Chicago. So we're really glad that you could join us today for what I think it's going to be a pretty intimate conversation. So today's topic is with Erik Severinghaus to discuss how to be a resilient entrepreneur. So this is an incredibly important topic, and certainly something that I think as someone who works with entrepreneurs all the time is something that we constantly see that folks need to think about how to expand their support structures, think about holistically the process that they're going through in terms of entrepreneurship. So many of us are oftentimes in entrepreneurship, we only focus on the success stories. We think we focus on the company that was started last, 2 months ago that has now, raised $1 billion. Well, in reality, that's very often not the case. The success stories that are kind of put out there in media, oftentimes, blanketing over, many of the ups and downs, which is, I think, I really applaud Erik for his transparency here and helping to bring some additional, insight into, how to think about many of these things as you're going about creating a new business, continuing to build your own brand and your own structure, and just holistically to enjoy this whole trip around the sun and the whole time here on Earth. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Erik to introduce himself and give a little bit of context. So Erik is actually back in the office. So Erik does have a day job as an executive vice president for Connexion. And so his extensive bio, and I know that many of you have met Erik or been a part of previous online discussions. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but we'll go and kick it over to Erik for a little context setting. And then today's conversation is largely going to be Q&A and just a conversation between Erik and myself. I'm also an Erik, E-R-I-K. So it's really great to meet another E-R-I-K, although I go by EJ. If you do have questions, please drop them into the chat. And so we will move to that as we approach kind of 12:40 and try to bring in everyone into the conversation. So with that, Erik, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Erik with a K, EJ. I love hearing that. I don't think I actually knew that about you. Folks, I am so excited to have this conversation. I'm always excited when I get the opportunity to talk to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs in the making. This is a conversation I think I'm particularly excited about because a lot of the context has kind of already been set. We had the great conversation a couple months ago where we started to get into some of the basic discussions around these topics. And I think that was recorded and is available for anybody that wants that. And what's exciting to me about this is that this is going to be a little bit more of a fireside chat, and hopefully we're going to be able to go a little bit deeper into some of the stuff that EJ, finds interesting, and that, I've got a preview of a few of the questions, and I'm really excited to kind of go deep into some of those topics. Just by way of setting quick context, I've been an entrepreneur since I was in high school, since before I really knew what an entrepreneur was. I applied for my first patent my sophomore year of high school. I think I incorporated my first business my junior year of high school. I've probably incorporated or been part of the founding team of something like 15 companies. I've been very fortunate. I've been part of 3 9-figure exits that, ranging from 180 million to about $250 million, and have had a really, really good time with that. I've also if you do the math and you say, well, he's had 3 nice exits and he's probably started 15 companies. There have been about 12 that have not been what we'll call learning experiences. Again, going back to EJ's point as he was setting context here, I think so often the folks get invited to speak to you all are folks who have had successes, who come talk about their successes, who might tell you things like, well, there's days when it's hard, but if you just keep, doing more faster, just keep working harder, eventually it all works out and it all becomes successful. And the reality is that the research shows that that's not true. 75% of venture-backed companies fail. That's after you get to a round of venture. The odds are worse if you haven't yet gotten to venture capital. And for me, what a lot of those bad lessons left me ill prepared as somebody who's got an undergraduate degree in entrepreneurship from North Carolina, a master's degree in entrepreneurship from Kellogg, has been part of Techstars and just about and has read almost every how to be an entrepreneur thing that's ever been written. What it left me ill prepared for in my journey was when things got very challenging, when things got very hard, I was not prepared for how to manage myself, how to manage my psychology, how to manage my emotions, how to manage my mentality, how to be a good leader in times of duress, in times of uncertainty, and in times of high stress. That was always sort of presented as something that just comes naturally to some people, and you either have it or you don't. And the research also shows that that's not true. The fact is that resilience being resilient to challenges, being resilient under stress, and all of those sorts of things are skills that can be learned, and it can be learned just like anything else. And so my book, Scale Your Everest, which is available for pre-order now and is being released on May 18th. Although weirdly, the audio version is already available. So if you're an audiobook listener, you can get the audio version. The written version is available May 18th. And so anyway, that is the guidebook that I was looking for when I was an entrepreneur, which was how to manage myself in these times of stress, uncertainty, challenge, et cetera, et cetera. And my mission right now is really to help entrepreneurs with a lot of these things that I didn't understand when I was going through the journey. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate the Polsky Center, EJ, Katie, Star Marcello has been a good friend to me through this journey in terms of really grabbing onto this message and saying, yeah, this is an underappreciated and undertaught aspect of entrepreneurship. And really leaning into it. So EJ, thank you very much. I appreciate being here. And with that, I'm excited to get into some of the questions you have.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Erik, and thanks for joining us. All right, so I think most people have a working definition, but I do want to just take a second to set the groundwork. How do you think about what resilience is? I know this is, obviously everything we're talking about here. And is it different in an entrepreneurial context versus other contexts that people might have be thinking about here during the pandemic?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start with why I use the word resilience. May is Mental Health Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. And, I very specifically try to avoid using the term mental health. And for me, it's because I'm kind of using this book to try to talk to 25-year-old Erik and prepare him for the journey that's ahead of him. And I would have never identified as somebody who had mental health challenges or somebody who needed to worry about mental health. In fact, even when I was in some of the deepest, darkest places of my journey, there were times where I was literally drinking too much, probably had some substance abuse issues, was sleeping very, very little, was contemplating literally throwing myself off of the balcony to my house, thinking that it would kind of make this pain go away. I was deep in suicidal ideation. Like if you were to do a mental health screening of me, you would have said this guy needs help. If you had asked me if I was having any mental health challenges, I would have said, no, absolutely not. I am a mentally healthy guy. I don't have depression. I don't have any of these kinds of things. And so for me, and this might just be unique to me, I just might be more stubborn, but for me, mental health never really resonated all that well. For those that it does, I think it's a great term. On the flip side, how do I be more mentally resilient? How do I train and prime my psychology to be able to perform better? That was always a topic I was really interested in. Like how do combat veterans, keep their cool despite being under fire? Like that always seemed cool to me. How does somebody who's depressed become undepressed? Again, just for me personally, was just sort of a less interesting topic. And so I focus a lot around that topic of mental resilience. It's all sort of a spectrum, right? And it just depends on where you line up on the spectrum. And all of us can be better at information process. So when I think about resilience, what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the ability to process information effectively, lead effectively, make decisions effectively, even in times of high stress and high duress. And what we know is that the chronic stresses of entrepreneurship, there's study after study that confirms that when the human mind is under chronic stress, we lose the ability to process information effectively. We lose the ability to make decisions as effectively. And we lose the ability to lead as effectively. And so what we also know is, as you mentioned, EJ, the entrepreneurial journey typically takes upwards of 8 years at a minimum. And so as you think about going into this journey, as you think about spending 8 years as an entrepreneur under periods of heightened stress and duress, how do you make decisions and lead effectively even as that's happening? That's really the focal point of what I'm trying to get across. Going back to your question of, is it different in entrepreneurship? I think the answers are yes and no. On the one hand, we know, research shows that entrepreneurs, oftentimes the people that actually quit their day job to go down this path, we know that entrepreneurs oftentimes have a higher degree of various mental challenges than the general population. We're predisposed to things like hypomania or manic depressive disorder. We're predisposed to a variety of things. Entrepreneurs also have twice the rate of suicidality and 3 times the rate of substance addiction or substance abuse challenges as that of the general population. And so we know that there's heightened stresses, but the thing that I learned in my research that struck me was that as much bad advice and bad information as is given to entrepreneurs, there is amazing ancient wisdom out there around how to handle your mind and your psychology when things are really, really hard. And so if you go to the Stoics, if you go to Eastern philosophy, if you go to like the Taoists, and if you go to the Buddhists, and if you go to a variety of these places, you find absolutely amazing advice for how to develop this mental resilience. It's just not typically packaged, discussed, and put in the context of the entrepreneurial journey. And that's really kind of the focus of what I tried to do. I don't think there's anything in the book that I wrote, like I didn't have some insight that nobody had ever had before. But what I tried to do was to take a whole bunch of stuff that's packaged up in a whole bunch of different places and make it relevant for today's founder and today's entrepreneur.
All right, so let's dive real deep. So you mentioned that some of the the mantra of entrepreneurship, that you're really pushing against here. So if you had to say, 2 or 3 things that you really want people to leave at the door, that's kind of part of that, the larger zeitgeist of entrepreneurship. What are those things? And so, maybe we can take some time.
Yeah, my favorite is do more faster. That's my favorite to sort of push against. It's I think such a common trope in entrepreneurship. And there's no question that entrepreneurs need to be able to run at speed in order to be effective. But if you're running really fast, but you don't stop to look at your map and stop to make sure you're running in the right direction, all you're doing is running in the wrong direction very, very quickly. And do more faster leads us to believe that the answer to every problem is increased activity, when in fact, so often what we need to do is stop, think, process. There's the common analogy that I use here is, if you're ever lost in the woods and if you're ever in a survival situation, you talk to any survival expert, they will tell you the first thing to do is stop. Like wherever you are, when you realize you are lost, stop moving, stop wandering, Stop all of your activities, stop. And get your bearings, get your senses, start to think, start to process, start to understand what's happening. Again, as entrepreneurs, we oftentimes need to be able to perform great activity, but we also need to recognize when we need to stop and we need to think and we need to get our bearings. There are so many pieces of advice that I'll have to push back on. I think the other one that I would probably choose, if I can only pick two, is there is this notion that one of the keys to entrepreneurship is what I'll call go all in. And I hear this. I hear this said in a variety of different contexts. The one that breaks my heart the most, I'll tell you, is the idea that in order to be an effective entrepreneur, we have to be willing to give up everything in order to succeed. And in many cases, that means, whether it's financially putting everything that we have at risk, all of our assets at risk, personally guaranteeing loans, other things like that. The one that really breaks my heart is I hear this question all the time, which is, can you be an effective husband, wife, mother, father, friend, etc., and be a driven and effective entrepreneur? And there is this notion out there in the zeitgeist that if you're going to be really good at being a successful entrepreneur, you almost have to be willing to push away all of those other things so that you can be laser focused on the success of your company. What the research actually shows is that more often than not, you're going to be far more effective as an entrepreneur if you cultivate and build and embrace that support network around you. If you balance what you're doing with your job with also, your responsibilities and your opportunities, from a family perspective, from a friend perspective, et cetera, and building that support network around you is actually key to your success. But again, there's this, and also risk mitigation is a key part of entrepreneurship. This idea of going all in and personally guaranteeing is something that I push back against really, really hard. And so, as with all things, balance is really important, and figuring out how do you have the balance. Like there are reasons why people say it's hard to be an entrepreneur. There are reasons why people say, put it all on the line. There's value to some of that advice, but we end up so focused on that side of it that we lose the balance of the other side.
That's something that definitely resonates with me, working at a university, particularly a prestigious, private institution. And we see a lot of very driven individuals. And one of the things that I'm often called to do is to remind, particularly students, that in everything you're doing, there's a choice. There's value in remembering, whatever path you're on in startup world. There's huge value that you have to remember. And I think sometimes people can forget that in the entrepreneurial process and feel so much kind of path dependency and fear of failure in different regards, that sometimes they can miss the successes. And just so is that something that it sounds like you've got some of those things from your own experiences?
Oh God, yes. I mean, look, the University of Chicago, right? I don't think I got into University of Chicago, so I'm not quite as good of an overachiever as the folks in your program. But I was very much one of those hyper overachievers and extremely goal focused. I was focused on how do you achieve the goal, not about the process to get there. And if I could only go back and give young Erik one piece of advice, and God, I know it sounds cliche, but the idea of focusing on the journey rather than the destination is such an important concept. And when I was going and starting my businesses, I never thought about how long they would take to be successful. I assumed they would be successful because I'm an optimist and I'm a great believer in my ability to execute. So I always assumed that they would be successful, in some cases wrongly. But I never thought about what is the timeline to that success. If I could go back and say one thing to young Erik, it would be recognize that if you're going down this journey, it's probably going to be years, probably 8 years or more. And figure out how do you become comfortable and enjoy and be effective daily in the journey. and figure out how to enjoy and celebrate each and every day of the journey. Because the reality is the destination ain't nearly as cool as you might think it is. And it's the journey that is actually so important. And paradoxically, by taking your eye off of the destination and instead focusing on the journey, you are far more likely to succeed and realize those outsized ambitions. And so that it's such an important concept, especially for overachievers, of which I have no question that the University of Chicago has their fair share and then some.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Erik. This is great. All right. So let's kind of maybe back up a little bit, because I think, this is an overwhelming topic. But one of the things I think that really stands out about your, book and your writings here is just, that there are things that you can do to build skills, so that resiliency and, support for yourself in this process, is less, maybe less cumbersome to think about. So what are some of those skills that you recommend people take a look at? And let's dive there.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a book full of them, and one of the things that I did in every chapter is there's specific exercises around it. And so a few of the ones that I think are most important, learning how to balance the activity with some stillness. For me, meditation was absolutely critical. It was infinitely harder for me to learn how to meditate for 10 minutes a day than it was for me to literally go run a marathon. I found it so much easier to go train, to go do things, than to relearn my ability to be comfortable with stillness and with quiet. Another one was breaking the cycle of constant activity. So we learn a lot about digital addiction, that's sort of out there in the media a fair bit right now. Getting into the habit of turning off my phone an hour before I would go to bed, and leaving my phone off for a half hour or an hour after I woke up, absolutely critical. These sorts of things allowed me to get better sleep. The other thing I would say is relearning the skill to sleep. I had some notion in my head that hard, committed entrepreneurs don't sleep all that much. That sleep is for lazy people. Sleep is for the weak. It's indulgent. What we actually find is that sleep is key to decision-making and performance. And so learning how to prioritize sleep, learning how to get rest, absolutely critical. And then the other one is learning how to manage our emotional state. So the big one for me in this, and meditation helped with this, and journaling really helped a lot with this. The big thing for me was learning how to separate a stimulus and then my feelings and my response to that stimulus. And so, walking into the office and being overwhelmed and bombarded by all of these things that are happening, it became a learned skill. There's this part of me that when the world is happening fast around me, I like to speed up. I like to like get into it, right? And go, like start barking things out. And I think some of this gets reinforced by the media. Like when the world gets crazy, what do the great leaders do? They start barking out orders and taking action, right? And what I've so often found is that the other side of that, learning how, when I feel the world speeding up around me, to take that breath and to slow everything down, to slow down my decision-making, to slow down my processing, to slow down my communication, so that I'm effectively taking in what's happening and then effectively communicating that out to other people. Some of those skills are just so incredibly important.
Well, entrepreneurship is definitely something that you're not going to get a lot of other people's opinions as you're going through this process, right? You're not talking to investors, talking to advisors, there's a lot being thrown at you. So I'm guessing that's part of what you're also talking about here in terms of
And you just prompted me on the one other one, which isn't necessarily a skill, but is so important. I mentioned it before, but I just want to touch on it again. Mm-hmm. Intentionally cultivating a support network.
Mhm.
Recognizing that when you're thinking about going down this path, or if you're already going down this path, every bit of research that exists out there in human psychology and physiology shows that when you are going through the journey of being an entrepreneur, you will, without question, be subjected to increased stress. And it will have an impact on your mental state, your physical state. Surrounding yourself and having that support network early before things become incredibly challenging, and building some of that habit. And when I talk about that support network, for me, it's having a therapist that I talk to on a biweekly basis, or if things are getting harder, a weekly basis. It's making sure that I've got my wife read into what it is that I'm doing so that she can understand my mental state and she can help coach me a little bit. It's having a peer group, especially if you're an entrepreneur, having a peer group of other entrepreneurs that understand what you're going through and can help provide context to some of those challenges. It can take the form of coaches, executive coaches. It can take the form of trusted mentors. There's a variety of other folks, but intentionally sitting down and saying, okay, if I'm going to go down this journey, I know that my mental state is critical to the success of my company. How do I build the team that is going to help me maintain my mental state so that I am optimally processing information, making decisions, leading, et cetera, et cetera. Having that team around you so you put yourself in the best odds for success, I have found to be absolutely critical. So that's another thing I just wanted to add on there.
And Erik, as you say that, one thing that strikes me is, you're not saying, your co-founder, you're not talking about your venture investor. Like, these are folks that see you as an individual in addition to, an entrepreneur. Is that correct? Is there anybody that you would, just have some caution, or, as people think about building that out, how should they think about that?
Yeah, the reality is that we have to be thoughtful about how we manage our communication to our investors, to our co-founders, to our team. Now, there's oftentimes more opportunity for transparency and honesty than I think we as entrepreneurs believe there is. I am not necessarily a believer in some of the ideas about like radical transparency to everybody in our world, because I think that we as entrepreneurs and CEOs and other, executive, co-founders, et cetera, we need to be thoughtful about how we're managing our communication to other people. And if I have a board, there's some level of honesty I'm going to have with my board. I need to be honest with them. I need to have integrity in terms of how I deal with them. But I am also trying to manage their perception of my business and of me, because candidly, I want something from them. I want to go get money from them later, right? If an investor's invested $1 million, I want him to go invest 5 million next year, or I want him to tell his investor buddies to invest 5 million. And if I am honest with him of, holy shit, like business is hard and I feel like I'm losing my mind, well, that investor is immediately, they're going to question whether I am the pony that they want to bet on for, their next round of capital, right? And I know that, like, that's clearly in my mind, it's clearly in their mind. And so I'm going to manage my communication with them through the lens of something I want from them. Having a support group of people that don't want anything from you. Like, okay, my therapist wants something from me. She wants me to pay my bill, right? But like, that's like $20 a conversation with insurance. Like, that's cheap. I can pay the $20. She has now gotten what she wants from me. And now I have the opportunity to dump as much stuff on her as I can. Like, to me, that's the bargain of the friggin' century, right? My CEO, CEO peer mentors don't necessarily want anything from me if I've got the right ones, if I've got the right friends, the right peer group, the right peer mentors, and et cetera. Like, they don't want anything from me other than probably reciprocal engagement. So when they're going through a hard time, they want me to be there for them. When I'm going through a hard time, they're going to offer to be there for me if they're the right types of people. And so you want those people in your orbit that you feel like you can be honest with, because you're not going to be trying to get more stuff out of them in the future. And so you're not trying to manage their expectation. That's the key to being able to take off like the CEO facade, the CEO armor, and then be more vulnerable, be more transparent with those people.
All right. So just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll be moving to a little bit more open audience Q&A here in about 5 to 10 minutes. All right. So there's so many places we could go, Erik. Apologies. I just want to ask so many questions. So let's step back a little bit and maybe talk a little bit about decision making. So you introduced some, kind of concepts in the book, I think that are meant to be helpful in thinking about, very real pressure, to make decisions, to move. One of the things that's a given in entrepreneurship is, well, I think entrepreneurship is really a process of change. Inherently, not very often are you actually like working in the exact same situation that you faced last week. So this whole concept of decision making and how to think about it is just ultra critical. So how do you think about the different paradigms, and what are some of the concepts you introduced in the book?
Yeah, you're right. There's almost no more dynamic environment than a startup, which is, I think, part of what draws many of us to it. And then at the same time, it induces a lot of stress into our minds. So I introduce these concepts in the book, which are throughout literature. You see other analogous ones. Like I didn't sort of like create these ideas. But what I call the sort of limbic system of the brain, the emotional center of the brain, I call the crocodile, and what I call the thoughtful prefrontal cortex part of the brain, I call the philosopher. And there's this idea, Buddha calls it the elephant and the rider. There are a variety of different contexts around this, but there is this idea that we actually have different parts of our brain and different parts of our mind that have evolved at different points in the evolution of our species. And these parts of our mind are optimized for very different environments. And so it can leave us almost feeling a little bit schizophrenic at times. So we have this limbic system of our brain, which is very emotional. It's very keyed into fear. It's very keyed into survival. It's very keyed in, and it's the sort of closest thing to our brainstem. It's really sort of tightly wound around sort of the center of our brain. It was the first thing to evolve, or not the first, but it evolved much sooner than the sort of philosopher side, which is the higher level thinking, the higher level decision making, the logic around how we think about things. And so these two systems, and actually there's lots of different systems, but these two systems in particular, there's always this sort of interplay. And one of the things that happens when we're under stress and when we're under duress is that the limbic system tends to take over more and more of our decision making. And this is a completely natural evolutionary adaptation, which is basically, if our mind is sensing danger, and that could be physical danger, like a bear is going to eat me, or it could be danger like I'm going to be cast out of society because everybody's going to think I'm a failure because my business failed. All of these things trigger that limbic and that emotional system in ways that we don't even understand and we don't realize. And all of that then colors our decision-making process. And to just give a really concrete example, there's a great local investor in Chicago, and I've met him 2 or 3 times. Many of you guys at the Polsky Center would know him. Met him 2 or 3 times, and he was a very prolific sort of angel investor in addition to being a venture investor. And we had great conversations. He gave me some really candid feedback, which I didn't realize at the time was a gift, but I was primed to be in this sort of defensive state. And after he'd given me some candid feedback around places where he thought my company could get better, I just kind of stopped following up with him. And the only reason I think that I stopped following up with him was that emotionally, I had this sort of sense that he wasn't, he wasn't as into me as I was into him. Like he was giving me some really candid feedback. And emotionally, I was afraid of the rejection, and I was afraid of him saying no. I had a tremendous amount of respect for him. And so the punchline here is I never got around to asking him if he'd be willing to invest in an early round, even though he was a dream investor for me. And about a year later, after I closed the round, I ran into him and he asked me, he said, "Hey, Erik, how come you never asked me to invest? I thought we had some really good conversations. I was really excited to be part of it. Did I do something wrong? Like, how come you never asked me to invest?" And that forced me to do a lot of thinking about like what was going on in my mind that I implicitly made this decision to not go ask this guy to be part of my round. And again, the decision, the realization that I came to is that the emotional side of my thinking subconsciously, that fear of rejection, that fear of failure, was overriding the rational side of my business that any rational calculus would have said, go ask this guy to invest. Like, he's taken 3 or 4 meetings. He's giving you great feedback. Like, things are really good. You have nothing to lose and you have a ton to gain by getting him to invest. Like, go ask him to invest. It is such an obvious thing. And if you go through the book, you will go through lots of examples that I kind of call out, whether it's hiring an employee that ends up being fraudulent and that ends up, just being an absolute mess. Like, and you can go through and you can find all of this really bad decision making. That I'm a guy who I think generally makes pretty good decisions, and a guy who is generally reasonably smart. And I just made like all of these stupefyingly terrible decisions as an entrepreneur. And so what I try to do is I try to tease apart, why did that happen? And the conclusion that I come to is that while under stress, I didn't realize it, but this emotional side of my brain was taking over. It was driving much more of the decision-making process than I even realized at the time. I had not learned very well how to tease these different parts of my mentality apart. And so as a result, I started making really bad decisions. And what you find is the literature shows that when you're under stress, that happens to everybody. Our IQ drops substantially when we're under stress. Our ability to make decisions just goes to hell. And so it's a really, really common phenomenon to make dumb decisions that you look back and in hindsight go, man, what was I thinking?
So Erik, for somebody that's in the process now, either with their own company, investors, see a lot of names I know on the call here, like what are some concrete things they can do to recognize where they might be at? And, other things, for those that are supporting entrepreneurs, what are some things that they can do to, be a part of that ecosystem, to be a part of that support, for folks that are building?
Yeah, I want to start with the second one first, if I could. There's a post that Shelby's probably going, yeah, Erik, you need to write this. There's a post that I've been meaning to write for like 2 months, and I'm going to write it, which is a sort of code of ethics for people that are mentoring and advising entrepreneurs in terms of how to help be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And I think it starts with an awareness that entrepreneurs are atypical in terms of people that go. If you go read Dr. Michael Freeman's research, you'll read an awful lot about the mind of the typical entrepreneur and how different it is from the mind of the median entrepreneur is very different than the median human being in general. And so understanding that entrepreneurs are to some extent a vulnerable population, people that have decided to go do this, we have just different ways of processing information. We have different neurologies than most of the rest of the world. From there, it gets to, in my opinion, focusing on rest, recovery, and the mentality of the entrepreneur. One of my greatest regrets over the last 10 years is when I was on the board of a company and the CEO was going through some really challenging physical things, as well as we were going through some really challenging business things. I focused 70% of my energy on how do I help him make better business decisions And I focused very little of my energy on how do I help him process some very traumatic events that he's in the process of going through. And without the example that I use all the time is the tools of a carpenter become worthless if the carpenter is in the midst of a nervous breakdown. So if the carpenter is in the process of going through a mental break, it doesn't matter how well they turn the wrench, they're going to screw building up the building, right? And we don't think about that so often. We don't think about, like, the effectiveness of the company starts with the mind and the mental state of the entrepreneur, and making sure to check in there, making sure to have understanding and context around what this human being is going through, and then being thoughtful about how to support them first as a human being, and then as, you know, a person with a job to do is absolutely critical. We don't ask entrepreneurs to work 9 to 5, 40 hours a week. We ask them to put their whole heart and soul into the building of a business. And we need to be thoughtful, and we need to treat them that way when we're figuring out how do we advise them, how do we coach them, you know, how do we work with them, et cetera. Again, a lot of these tactical things, making sure they have a support network, making sure that they're taking time for themselves. We oftentimes say, hey, I want you to have work-life balance. And then we send emails all night, all weekend, right? You know, I tell my team all the time, like, if they're responding to emails at 3 a.m., I tell them to get the hell off of email, like go sleep, right? If they're responding to emails on a Sunday, I tell them to get off of email, like take time for yourself, rest, recover, be ready, because the hard times are going to come. EJ, that was the second part of your question. You'd asked me the first part. Now I forgot what it was.
No, it's okay. I think so we've had our first question from the chat, and I do think this is a great subject. So the question, and thanks, I believe that was from Alex, what related to, you know, not everybody is going to be a venture capital backed startup. You know, so how are the emotional challenges of starting a small business, you know, similar or different to a VC backed, you know, startup? And I realize, you know, you haven't been on the, you know, you've started a lot of VC backed startups in this space, but you know, no,
I've done it the other way too. The one I was just talking about was actually, that was a self-funded series of pizza franchises. So if you guys have ever had Papa John's Pizza in Chicago, that was us, and that's what I'm talking about there. So I think the challenges are roughly identical. I think the velocity at which you reach the challenges is faster in a business where there's substantial outside capital coming in. So many of these challenges around, hey, I'm personally identified with my business. Many of these challenges around payroll is up to me. And I got a whole lot of people in my business whose families depend on a check that comes on a biweekly basis. And that is my responsibility to hit. I mean, that is a heck of a burden to put on anybody. And whether that's in a family business with 2, 3, 5 people, whether that's in a, whether that's in a 5,000 person hyper growth startup, those dynamics are really, really similar. Now, it's probably the one place where I think I should have done a better job in the book. And it's probably the one place where I don't think I tease this stuff apart as well as I should, in terms of, I tend to conflate entrepreneurship with high growth startup, because it's like the universe that I run in more often than not. And so I tend to conflate those topics. Although when you get to the root of it, the challenges, the journey that the founder is on, you know, it's far more similar than it is different. It just tends to get bigger faster. And so you have less time to adjust when you're taking in outside capital and when your company's growing quicker.
No, I think that's a great point. You know, certainly, you know, we work with many, you know, self-identified kind of small business owners in our work, and, you know, the issues that they're dealing with are really no different in many ways. You know, they can sometimes be even more personal and more complicated, because, you know, you could be, you know, working with a family member, you could have taken investment from, you know, the person down the street, you know, which, can start to conflate some of those things that you're talking about in terms of personal support network and, business, business ecosystem, et cetera.
The money that broke my heart to lose was the friends and family money. It was about $250,000 that came from friends and family. That was infinitely harder for me to lose than the millions of dollars that I lost from venture capitalists. I didn't like losing millions from VCs, like that sucked. But losing money from friends and family was infinitely harder. And those were the conversations that just broke my heart to have. And so those dynamics exist and may even be more acute, if you're running a restaurant or dry cleaners or whatever else. Oftentimes, you're going to have more intimate capital associated with your business. And, these sorts of dynamics can become even more acute.
Yeah, the other thing I would point out is, in anytime you're starting a business, in general, there is a certain artificial escalator, that gets put in as you take out external capital. And so, for any owner, defining what success looks like, defining the timelines, thinking through realistically, as you've talked about, is so critical. For many small businesses, I'm not necessarily sure that folks have always, had a realization as to, do I want to run this forever? Is this, what does success look like? And so that's the only thing that I would add that's a little bit different as a VC backed versus a small businesses. You tend to have slightly different. You don't have that artificial escalator, which sometimes can be going too fast in a VC backed startup for sure. But it can be helpful to understand what type of change or steadiness you're trying to achieve in all of this. Does that sound right, Erik?
Yeah, the one other thing I would say is, I think oftentimes people that are in, let's say, outside of the if you're not getting access to VC capital, if you're going to get an SBA loan, like if you're taking an outside capital but it's not VC capital, it may not force some of the levers of growth on you quite as quickly. But the other thing that oftentimes happens is there's a lot more temptation or necessity to personally guarantee. And so you end up with a lot more of your personal assets at risk in face of failure, which creates a whole nother level of dynamics that are just absolutely brutal and stress inducing. And so these things are balanced out on kind of both sides of the equation.
All right, we had another question from Christopher related to some of the resources that you have found in building your own personal resilience and in writing this book. Are there any particular resources that stand out? So share with folks.
Yeah, a ton. There's so much great advice out there. So number one, I would say turn off TechCrunch, turn off Gary Vaynerchuk, turn off, I could go through a list. All of those, all of those types of entrepreneurial media, turn as much of that off as you can. That stuff tends to make the problem worse, not better. Great things to read: Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, two of the more Epictetus, some of the various different Greek Stoic philosophers. Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces. Joseph Campbell is probably the most sort of important person that helped me put context behind this journey, reading a lot of his stuff. Lao Tzu, absolutely phenomenal. So this is a lot of the timeless wisdom. If you want stuff that's a little bit more current, I don't think there's a ton of great things out there. I think Reboot by Jerry Colonna is really quite good. I'm trying to think. Some of Nassim Taleb's stuff, some of his stuff, I think it's a little bit out there. I don't want to say out there, like some of his stuff I don't agree with the way it's presented, but Anti-Fragile in particular by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, I think is a particularly good resource for entrepreneurs. And I think there's a lot of concepts in there that can be really, really helpful in sort of the mentality of being the entrepreneur. The two two sort of more recent companies that have come into formation. I mentioned Dr. Michael Freeman before. He's got an organization called Econa, ECONA.net, which is a great science-based resource for entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial mental health and mental resilience. There's another one called Founders First Community, which is run by a good friend of mine and a guy that we've started many companies together. It's run by a guy by the name of Aaron Houghton, and it's an absolutely tremendous resource for entrepreneurs as well.
Great, that's great. So, and one thing that I would maybe add here is just, folks are going to be in a variety of different spots. So, I think anyone who's ever tried to kind of build mindfulness and build community realizes that it's not an overnight activity. What advice would you have for somebody that feels like they, might be in a hard spot, might be in a more immediate kind of situation? And then, how do you think about getting folks in your corner, for the longer term? When's the right time to start down this path?
Yeah. So if there's an acute situation, recognize that talking to someone and getting help is a feature of strength, not weakness. And it's important to have that support. So finding, the default for me is go talk to a good therapist. And find one that you can communicate with and that you think, hears you and understands you. And particularly if you feel like you're, having challenges with sleep, if you're having challenges with substances, if you're having some of those dark thoughts that I had, be braver than I was and have the wisdom and the strength to go open the door and have a conversation with someone that can help you. That I think is absolutely critical, particularly for anybody that this stuff is hitting them deep in their heart, going and getting that sort of help. And then beyond that, you can start to build the longer term, the longer term resilience, the longer term kind of support network, the longer term habits. You're exactly right, EJ, in that this stuff, this is a lifelong process, right? And it's one of the hard things about writing a book on this is it triggers my imposter syndrome for sure. Because whenever I'm on and talking to you or talking to anybody about these kinds of topics, I'm then thinking through in the back of my mind, like, man, am I a hypocrite? Because I actually haven't done a good job of meditating this week. And I'm not journaling as well as I should be. And I lost my temper the other day, yada, 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 right? Perfection is unattainable. It's a lifelong journey for everybody. But there is a spectrum and you can, getting out of those acute situations and starting to build that resilience and start, and then every day that you miss it, every day you don't do it, every day you screw up on, let that day go and say, all right, you know what, now I got a chance to go be better tomorrow. And that's kind of the key to it for me is not holding myself too accountable for my failures. I always want to be accountable, but not holding myself too accountable, not beating myself up too much for the fact that maybe yesterday I didn't do as good of a job as I should have. Because hey, I got a brand new day and I got a whole path ahead that I can work on getting better.
And one thing that strikes me, and I know we're getting close to our time here, but I'd love, as you are kind of wrapping up, could you speak a little bit to how fear plays into all of this? So oftentimes what you're talking about is, fears and, that we're carrying with us from maybe not acknowledging that are adding weight, how, and within entrepreneurship, that's, a lot of times people are trying to figure out a healthy fear of, growing in certain ways, any other kind of, concluding thoughts? And I'd love just to hear a little bit of perspective on how you think about that.
Yeah, fear is the thing that makes adaptability really, really difficult. And for me, I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying from the fear that I had until a good friend of mine, a great entrepreneur by the name of Justin Massa, pointed out to me one day. He said, I can tell that things are breaking down for me because I feel my eyes start to twitch. My left eye started to twitch. And I didn't even realize it up until that point, but my left eye had developed this twitch. And it really, the root cause of it was that it was my body struggling under the psychological load of the fact that I was unwilling to forgive myself for the mistakes that I had made.
Mhm.
I kept beating myself up over everything that I'd done wrong, and I made plenty of mistakes the same way that we all do. And then at the same time, as I was going through that, I was scared shitless that this business that I had come to be completely associated with, I didn't hardly know how to introduce myself as Erik Severinghaus without saying founder and CEO of this business that I had, managed to be completely associated with was potentially going to fail. And if you run any sort of an entrepreneurial venture, you will almost certainly go through those periods of time where you are worried that your business is going to fail. And that fear of how is my girlfriend or my fiance going to look at me? How are my parents going to look at me if I lose some of the money that they invested? How are my friends going to look at me? Because right now they think it's so cool that I'm an entrepreneur and I'm like on the cover of magazines. And like when I go to them and say, well, no, I'm no longer an entrepreneur because my business failed. That fear was terrifying and crippling. And it was the thing that made decision-making, rational decision-making and information processing extremely, extremely difficult. And so for me, what it took was actually, ironically, Justin went through similar challenges before I did. It took sitting down with Justin and understanding, like, what does it mean to be a failed entrepreneur? Does everybody hate you? Does nobody want to talk to you? Like, do you still get invited to parties? Like, do your parents still love you? Does your wife look at you like you're a failure? Like, what does it mean to be a failed entrepreneur? Because even though we know 75% of venture-backed companies will fail, there are very, very few stories out there of failed entrepreneurs. And there's very little that gets talked about, with any rationality. And so I had no playbook. When I started to contemplate the idea that I might be a failed entrepreneur, I had no playbook for what the hell that meant. Mm-hmm. So, my strong encouragement is do a little bit of introspection, a little bit of self-analysis, understand what are those fears that might be holding you back? What are those fears that might be weighing down your mind? And figure out, the only fears that have power over us are the unspoken ones and the ones that we haven't confronted. Once we confront them, they go away, they become infinitely easier to manage. And so do some self-analysis, take an inventory, understand what is it that you're really actually kind of worried about. And then figure out, how do you look that in the eye? How do you deal with it? How do you confront it? How do you make sure that it's no longer an unspoken fear? And then use that to get to the root of it. And that is the critical thing to sort of getting that weight off of those shoulders and allowing you to then be a far more effective entrepreneur. And oh, by the way, a much happier person.
Well, that's incredibly well put. So Erik, thank you so much for your time today, for joining us. This has been a wonderful discussion and just truly appreciate your insights and vulnerability and trying to help others in the community. So any other concluding thoughts?
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much, EJ, and thanks to everybody for taking some time to listen.
All right, thanks so much, everyone. Please join us again in future Entrepreneurial Essentials, and we look forward to engaging with folks here, and definitely take advantage of the mentoring network and other opportunities for growing that support that Erik talked about here. All right, thanks so much, Erik. Have a great day.
Thank you.